Hello everybody, this is TipTopMTG here today with another Magic the Gathering video. In today's video, we are looking at D&D Adventures in the Forgotten Realms and the top 10 most expensive cards in the set. So essentially we're going to be counting down, talking about why each card is so expensive, what it does, what might happen with the prices in the future, and kind of giving you my advice. Now, before we jump into any of this, I want to give a couple disclaimers. First off, these are pre-order prices. This is being filmed before the set is released. On top of that, these are Card Kingdom's prices in USD. So what that means essentially is that these are going to be slightly higher than you might be able to find it on something like TCG Player or at your local game store, but just know they're all higher. So, the values might be off by like $1 or $2 in either direction, but this should be the general order and the cards that people are the most excited about and the cards that you should be keeping an eye out when you are cracking packs if you decide to do so, or just know that if you want one of these cards, they are going to be a bit more expensive. So why don't we jump right into this? After we talk about these 10 cards, I'm also going to compare them to Strixhaven and talk about the top 10 cards of both sets and kind of compare the value of this set compared to the last one. Either way, let's jump right into this. Starting off at number 10, we have Acererak the Archlich. It is a 3-cost legendary creature zombie wizard 5/5, and when it enters the battlefield, if you haven't completed Tomb of Annihilation, return it to its owner's hand and venture into the dungeon. Then, when it attacks, for each opponent, you create a 2/2 black zombie creature token unless that player sacrifices a creature. So this is currently going for $10 and is a mythic. Now, I think there are a lot of contributing factors leading to the high price of this guy. I think one of the biggest ones is that it's legendary. For those of you who don't know, Commander is the most popular format in Magic, and the heart of a Commander deck is a legendary creature, so naturally they often have higher prices. On top of that, however, what I've been seeing a lot of talk about is the fact that this is a creature that as long as you have 3 mana, you can just keep replaying. Because it says if you haven't completed Tomb of Annihilation, you return it to its owner's hand and venture into the dungeon. Now here's the thing, it doesn't say venture into, the dungeon of Tomb of Annihilation. You can choose to repeatedly do a different dungeon, and essentially this turns into 3 mana, venture into the dungeon. You can cast it as many times as you want, but each time you're also getting a creature ETB, which is honestly really huge. I don't think this is going to see a lot of play of people wanting to complete Tomb of Annihilation and then get this on the battlefield. Yes, it's a 3-cost 5/5 that has a benefit, so it's not bad if that happens, but I think a lot of the power is going to come from its combo potential of being able to constantly replay it for 3 mana. That means if you have a way to generate mana off of it ETBing or something along those lines, it could be very easy to go infinite. So I think a lot of its potential is going to be held in its combo potential. Next, we have Xanathar, Guild Kingpin. It's 4 blue and a black for a legendary creature beholder 5/6. It says at the beginning of your upkeep, choose target opponent. Until end of turn, that player can't cast spells. You may look at the top card of their library anytime. You may play the top card of their library, and you may spend mana as though or mana of any color to cast spells this way. So essentially, in a 1v1 format, it means that you can, on your turn, your stuff can't be countered because they can't cast spells, and then you're also getting to play cards, including lands, off the top of your opponent's library, ignoring colors. So honestly, this is a very powerful card, and I think, first off, it's Commander, so we can contribute that to why it is one of the more expensive cards in the set, but also it does seem very powerful. Even if you're ignoring the fact that you can cast spells off the top of your library, it shuts down your opponent from doing stuff on your turn, which again, can be really big in combo decks because in some formats, it often breaks down to like, oh, I can combo off at instant speed, meaning in reaction to your combo, I combo. And this can kind of stop that. However, it is 6 mana and there are effects that do this for way cheaper. So obviously, I think this is going to be a popular commander from this set to be like a commander or a popular legendary creature that will be a commander. Although I do think it does fall in the Sen triplet style of commander where it's just not that fun to play against. And I think people are going to realize that, oh, after I've played it a couple times, it's actually not as fun as I thought. However, I cannot discount that one of the most popular things like people like to do is play with other people's cards, and this really does that, and it lets you do it very repeatedly, very easily. So keep that in mind. Next, at number 8, we have the Book of Exalted Deeds. It's white, white, white for a legendary artifact, and it says, at the beginning of your end step, if you gained 3 or more life this turn, create a 3/3 white angel creature token with flying. And then you can pay 3 mana, tap, and exile the Book of Exalted Deeds to put an enlighten counter on target angel. It gains, you can't lose the game and your opponents can't win the game. Activate only as a sorcery. So this is a very, very powerful effect. I mean, it essentially says, deal with this angel or you can't win, like literally. So if you're running against a deck who doesn't have a creature removal, which oftentimes mono red decks are gonna have trouble getting rid of anything with toughness like 5 or greater. And so if you can manage to do that, this could literally just say win the game for 6 mana. However, obviously it can be removed. I think a lot of its potential is going to come based on its ability to kind of do some more cheeky combos, that you could kind of say. So for instance, Faceless Haven is a card currently in Standard that lets you pay 3 snow mana and it becomes a 4/3 creature with vigilance and all creature types until end of turn. So you could, for instance, pay the 3 mana to Faceless Haven, then pay 3 mana with the Book of Exalted Deeds to put that Enlighten counter on the land, and then the land essentially says you can't lose the game and your opponents can't win, and as long as you keep that land to land, your opponents can only get rid of it with land destruction, which, by the way, is not very common in decks, at least not in Standard and Historic. So I think that this has some very great combo potential, unless there's some ruling that stops that interaction, but it doesn't say as long as it's a creature, it just says it gains. And so I think that if that combo is a thing, it could very well be a powerful thing, and also just people like effects like this. People like effects that say win the game. They like effects that say your opponents lose the game. And they also like effects that say you can't lose the game, because if you can't lose the game, you essentially win the game. So keep that in mind. I keep saying keep that in mind. Let's just move on. At number 7, we have Ellywick Tumblestrum. It's a 4-cost green legendary planeswalker Ellywick, and it has 4 loyalty. So it's a 4 loyalty for 4 mana. Pretty good. You can +1 it to venture into the dungeon. So this is going to vary in effect depending on which dungeon you're doing and what part it's in. But the fact that it's repeatable and you actually gain loyalty from doing it means that it's a generally good ability. You know, sometimes planeswalker +1s are a little bit more situational, and they'll often say up to 1, for instance. So up to 1 target creature gets -2/-0 until end of turn. Not very useful if your opponent doesn't have a creature, but I think venture into the dungeon will always be useful. And then you can -2 and look at the top 6 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature from among them and put it into your hand. If it's legendary, you gain 3 life. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So +1, kind of do this dungeon thing. -2, maybe go get a creature to help protect Ellywick, or just, you know, kind of turn this into a cantrip. I mean, think about it like this. That minus ability is almost like a selective cantrip, which is pretty good. And then if you can manage to -7, which you really shouldn't be counting on ulting with a planeswalker unless they're designed around that. So something like Nissa from Zendikar Rising is kind of designed to ult, but here it's -7. You get an emblem with creatures you control have trample and haste and get +2/+2 for each differently named dungeon you've completed. So Ellywick wants to complete all 3 dungeons, and if you do that, your creatures get +6/+6 and have trample and haste, which basically just means you win the game if you have creatures. But that's a big if. So I actually find this, you know, it needs you to have creatures. It needs you to be completing a dungeon. So if you're doing that, this seems like the perfect card. And yes, you don't technically need to be in a dungeon deck in order to enjoy and have fun with this card. I mean, a mono green deck would love that -2 ability and can get value off the +1. But that ultimate does really want you to be in that style of dungeon deck that also goes wide. But some of the dungeons do help you go wide, just so you know. So that's kind of interesting to see. I'm not a super huge fan of this card, but it's also not my least favorite. And so it's going for $12. All right, stepping up the price, we have this guy, Grandmaster of Flowers, going for $15. He's a 4-cost legendary planeswalker, Bahamut. It's a 3 loyalty planeswalker, and it says as long as it has 7 or more loyalty counters on it, he's a 7/7 dragon god with flying and indestructible. And that's on your opponent's turn as well. So I don't know exactly how attacking it works. Can it block for itself? I'm not sure. That'll be something we'll have to explore in the rules, but because of that, it seems very, very good that he can kind of block for himself, if that's the case. And he also has abilities. He has 2 +1. So he has +1, target creature without first strike, double strike, or vigilance can't attack or block until your next turn. So it's very, like, specific, but if you know, it is very good. You have a 7/7 creature with flying and indestructible. If they have a reacher or a flyer, you can kind of say, no, you can't block, or you can say, hey, this thing is gonna kill my Grandmaster of Flowers, I can make it so it can't attack. And it's until your next turn, so it's a long-lasting effect. Then you can +1 and search your library and or graveyard for a card named Monk of the Open Hand. And with that, you reveal it, put it into your hand, and if you search your library this way, shuffle. So Monk of the Open Hand is a 1-cost creature, elf monk, 1/1 in white, and it says whenever you cast your second spell each turn, put a +1/+1 counter on it. So essentially, +1, go get a creature out of your library. It feels very, very random to me, but I don't know. I feel like you're mostly going to be using it for the top ability, the fact that he's a 7/7 indestructible flying dragon after you've used his abilities 4 times. But also, this whole thing just feels weird. He has an ultimate that requires you to get up to 7, but that's really, really hard to do. And it's not like Monk of the Open Hand helps him get there. This just feels very convoluted to me, but if you manage to get it off, it does seem very powerful. Next, we have Old Gnawbone. He's a 7-cost green legendary creature dragon, 7/7 with flying, and it says whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, create that many treasure tokens. This is going for 20 bucks, and I can definitely see why. If this thing hits someone for 7, you create 7 mana, which is utterly insane. I can see a lot of decks really being able to take advantage of this. This is going to be in those decks that are want to be dealing damage, but like I said in the spoiler video when I talked about this is one of those cards that says if you're winning, win more. And those generally aren't the best cards in the game because, well, you're already winning. But on the other hand, you also do need to close out the game. So they're not the worst thing in the world, but I do think it definitely has this feeling of, oh, you're still able to hit your opponent so you get a benefit compared to, you know, cards that help you come back from losing. And it always feels bad to put in cards that say, hey, if I'm losing, you know, I want to cast this, but it oftentimes is important just because it, you know, you do need to be able to turn those games around. You're not going to be winning every game. And this is one of those cards where if you draw it while you're losing, it just kind of feels bad. And, it is a 7/7 for 7 with flying at its base. So I guess that does kind of prop it up. That kind of helps you win. But I do think there are going to be those situations where you have this card and you're like, well, I just can't attack. And it's going to feel really bad. Next, we have Lolth, the Spider Queen. It's a 5-cost black legendary planeswalker Lolth for loyalty, and whenever a creature you control dies, put a loyalty counter on it. Then you can pay 0 to draw a card and lose a life. Then you can -3 to create 2/1 black spider creature tokens with menace and reach, which, by the way, if those die, you get loyalty counters. So if you, for instance, create the 2/2/1s and then they end up dying, it was almost like Lolth just -1'd. Then you can -8 and get an emblem with whenever an opponent is dealt combat damage by 1 or more creatures you control. If that player lost less than 8 life this turn, they lose life equal to the difference. So the idea is you can hit them for 1 damage, and then that gets moved up to 8 at the end of the turn. But if you hit them for 7 damage, it's only moved up to 8 at the end of the turn. So it's almost encouraging you to deal as little damage as possible to each opponent unless you're going to deal more than 8. So if I can swing at you and deal 7 damage to you, or I can swing at you and deal 1, it's actually better to deal 1, just because then you have more creatures untapped or whatever the situation is. So that emblem is really, really interesting and unique, but I think this card just has everything going for it. It has, protection if you need it, card draw. It has an ult that can be very devastating, but it doesn't win you the game instantly. It just feels like one of those cards that is going to fit in a lot of different types of decks, and I do think it is worthy of that $20 price tag. Then again, these are pre-order prices, so expect prices to go down after the set comes out. Next we have Iymrith, Desert Doom, also going for 20 bucks. It's a 5-cost blue legendary creature dragon, 5/5 with flying, and it has ward 4 as long as it's untapped. So I talked about this in the spoiler video, but a 5/5 for flying with flying for 5 is really good for blue. Blue generally doesn't get creatures with equal power and toughness to its mana value. That's just not something it gets that often, and this has a lot more on it. So it has ward 4 as long as it's untapped. So unless you're doing something with it, it's going to be very hard for your opponents to target it. And then when it deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card. And if you have fewer than 3 cards in your hand, you draw cards equal to the difference. So this is one of those cards that says, hey, if you're losing or you're feeling like you're slipping out of the game, this card can really help. It's hard for your opponents to get rid of, and once you do make that move, maybe you're going from 0 cards up to 3, and that's going to feel really good and maybe be able to get you back to winning. So I prefer this dragon just because it is a big thing in the air, and that's really awesome, but it also has that potential to bring you back from a win, or bring you back from losing, sorry. And I think that that is why it is better than Old Gnawbone, just generally. Next, we have Demilich, also going for 20 bucks. It's blue, 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 blue for a creature, skeleton, wizard, 4/3. And it says this spell costs blue less to cast for each instant and sorcery spell you've cast this turn. So if you've cast 4 instant or sorceries, this costs 0 mana. And then when this attacks, exile up to 1 target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard, copy it, you may cast the copy. So, you cast a bunch of spells to get this out for free. The next turn, you swing with it and get to cast a copy of the spell, which is pretty awesome. But you do need to pay for the copy. So, it doesn't say without paying its other cost, I believe. I believe that's the ruling on this one, because it's not just saying copy it, it's saying you may cast the copy. So keep that in mind. It's not like you're free casting it, but it does give you the option to cast it out of your graveyard. Then it says you may cast Demilich from your graveyard by exiling 4 instants and or sorcery cards from your graveyard in addition to paying its other cost. So essentially it has escape 4, where you're going to pay blue, 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 and exile 4 other instants and sorcery cards from your graveyard and be able to cast it. However, that's not exactly how it works, because that reduction in cost will still apply to it when it's in the graveyard. So if you cast 4 instants and sorceries, you can then exile those 4 instants and sorceries you just cast to then play it from the graveyard. So this has a lot of recursion. It recurs other instants and sorceries. It recurs itself. It just feels like one of those cards that's going to help you win those grindier games, because you can be casting your spells twice, say if they get countered. You can be casting your creatures multiple times, and it lets you use your graveyard as a resource. So I think this card just gives you so much resistance and resilience against your opponent's removal spells that I think it's going to be very good in those 1v1 formats. And maybe even not 1v1 formats, but I think it's going to shine in 1v1. And then number 1, we have Tiamat. It's 2 white, blue, black, red, green, for a legendary creature, dragon god, 7/7 with flying. And when it enters the battlefield, if you cast it, so not if you resurrect it, search your library for up to 5 dragon cards not named Tiamat that each have different names, reveal them, put them into your hand, then shuffle. So this says it's a 7/7 with flying for 7 that says draw 5 cards. But not only do you draw 5 cards, you draw the 5 cards that you want. Of course, they do need to be dragons, but this seems really, really good to me. It's going for 40 bucks. Again, we can kind of go back to the legendary creatures at the beginning of this list. Legendary creatures are naturally going to be higher in price because, hey, people want to build them. But naturally, 5 color commanders are often the most expensive because they are considered some of the more fun ones, just because they can kind of do anything. You can put any card in Magic that's not banned in a 5 color commander deck. So yeah, on top of that, this seems like one of the cards that's meant to be the really powerful one and be the face of the command or of the set. So yeah, keep that in mind. This is the most powerful card in terms of, or not powerful, the most expensive card, and I expect to be seeing lots of commander decks built around it if people can manage to get their hands on a copy. Now, in this video, we didn't talk about the variants. So, the full art, the D&D sketch kind of art, or the D&D land art. Those will be covered in a separate video where I talk about the top 10 most expensive variants or alternate art versions of cards. That'll be in a later video. But what I do want to talk about is the comparison between this and Strixhaven. And across the board, this set is looking to be better priced in terms of having more value than Strixhaven. Both of these were taken before the set came out. So the prices on the right are not Strixhaven now. They are Strixhaven when it came out, which I think is a much more fair justification or comparison, because obviously they're going to be lower now, but we don't know what Dungeons and Dragons Adventures in the Forgotten Realms is going to be like in 3 months, so we really can't compare what Strixhaven's like now and do that pretty fairly. But you'll notice in every single category, D&D is higher. So the most expensive card in Strixhaven was Professor Onyx. Here it's Tiamat for $7 extra. Demilich does drop pretty quickly to 20, but that's still above Kasmina. And a lot of these cards I suspected were highly priced because they didn't know how they were going to end up playing. I believe Professor Onyx has really sunk in price. I could be wrong. Let me quickly check that. I mean, it's still pretty expensive, but it's actually only $8.77 compared to the $32 it was at originally. It was known that Strixhaven wasn't a very value-heavy set, so it's not that impressive. For instance, Kasmina was $17.99, now going for $2.88. And actually, if we look at the Strixhaven, The most expensive card in the set is, well, ignoring the like alternate art, is still Beledros, going for 15 bucks. So you'll notice those first, Beledros really didn't move in price, but those commanders, or those planeswalkers really did. And I suspected that's because they were kind of hard to tell how well they were going to work. And generally planeswalkers are just naturally more expensive because they're very hard to judge power level ahead of time. And, Card Kingdom would much rather sell them at a higher price and then have, lower the price later rather than selling them too cheap. Either way, guys, that is going to do it for this video. It's a little longer than my normal top 10s, but I really wanted to break them down. If you enjoyed, hit that like button, subscribe to see more awesome content like this, and I will see you guys in the next one.